Okay, we're ready when you are, SG. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Professor Dominic McVey, and I am the Honorary Consul of Namibia to Wales and Non-Executive Director at Trademark Africa. It is my pleasure to be chairing today's conversation on sustainable net zero transition, providing green jobs and growing prosperity. We're delighted to have here today His Excellency Wamkele Mene, the Secretary-General of the AfCFTA. And during today's event, we're going to explore opportunities for the developing world and how it's going to deliver to net zero transition. And with over 1 billion young people in emerging markets looking for job opportunities, there is a critical need for us to discuss today how we create those job opportunities and bring about the right skills to the market. Countries are seeking to transition to net zero, and it's about growing their economies at the same time and creating high-skilled jobs. For example, more builders and engineers to construct electric vehicles on the continent of Africa, where those rare minerals and resources are based, building those values within Africa. Maintaining equipment, being able to service the solar farms. It was estimated that countries are going to need tens of thousands of trained and qualified people for that. Through my work and understanding the role of the AfCFTA, it is clear that this won't be able to be achieved without the incredible work of His Excellency. So it's my pleasure and delightment to introduce His Excellency Wamkele Mene, the Secretary-General of the Continental Free Trade Area. His Excellency has served in a role since 2020 and is in fact his second term at delivering the world's largest free trade area. I'd like to not say much more, Your Excellency, because I know you're going to enlighten us. So I would like for you to make a few opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. First, let me thank you, Dominic, and the other organizers for hosting and convening us here today for this important topic. It's a pleasure for me to participate here because on the continent we face twin challenges. The first challenge is, as you've just alluded, the challenge to create a single market in the context of the AfCFTA. And then second, of course, we are doing that when we are faced with an unprecedented crisis, and that is climate change. Leaders across sectors and geographies have gathered here in a spirit of collaboration to discuss how we can achieve a just and sustainable transition, one that would drive job creation, ensure shared prosperity, and resilience in Africa's most climate vulnerable communities. The private sector has a very critical role to play, not only in creating green jobs, but also in ensuring shared prosperity across countries. Africa's wealth of renewable energy and resources and reserves of critical minerals are profound sources of potential competitive advantage that the continent of Africa can leverage on. Adding value to these natural endowments is critical to the global green and digital transition as recognized in the Nairobi Declaration. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, in the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, our mission is to create an integrated, prosperous, and unified African continent. As we chart Africa's future, building resilience against climate shocks whilst fostering inclusive growth is central to our objective. Africa holds unique challenges and potential in the area of climate change. We face severe climate vulnerabilities, yet we also hold remarkable opportunities to pioneer a green economic transformation. All of us are very much aware of the challenges of climate change. We see drought in Zambia. Previously, we saw drought in the Sahel, leading to insecurity, reduced economic activity. As we confront the mounting threats of climate change, the continent of Africa faces significant risks that threaten our economies, our stability, and the well-being of our people. Severe weather patterns, rising sea levels, and devastating natural disasters impact millions and millions of people, disrupting lives and livelihoods. The Nairobi Declaration correctly draws attention to the potential for a virtuous cycle of renewable energy and deployment and economic activity, with a special emphasis on adding value to Africa's natural endowments, to advance not only on the African green industrialization and green intra-Africa trade drive, but also global decarbonization efforts. Looking forward, climate change will likely intensify these challenges. Agriculture and manufacturing sectors are increasingly at risk from droughts, while coastal cities and critical infrastructure face escalating threats from rising sea levels and extreme weather events. Currently, 460 million people, 36% of Africa's population, is exposed to climate hazards such as droughts, heat, water stress, and flooding. By the year 2050, this number is expected to nearly double under a 2% Celsius warming, 2% degrees warming scenario. This stark projection highlights the critical need for resilient, adaptive strategies to safeguard our continent's future. The private sector has a critical role to play in all of this. Recent facts reflect that mobilizing private investment in Africa still faces significant challenges. In 2020, it is estimated that Africa received $29.5 billion in climate finance, but only $4.2 billion was from the private sector, meaning only 14% of that amount came from the private sector. Moreover, the flows of these funds are uneven. 10 countries received 76% of the total private finance for climate change on the continent, and private investment tends to focus on energy systems, whilst we need a broader focus including transport, waste management, and industry development. Supporting climate change, adaptation, and mitigation means continuing the advancement of structural economic transformation and technological upgrading. The private sector, with its resources, capacity to scale, is in a very unique position as a catalyst for Africa's green transformation. In previous discussions on Africa's economic development, we have emphasized that the private sector is a central part of Africa's continental progress. It has the capacity to innovate, to scale solutions, and create sustainable livelihoods at an unprecedented pace. We cannot rely for our industrial development purely on old methods of advancing. We must invest in green industries to foster resilience, to create green jobs, to create jobs for young Africans, and to alleviate poverty. By prioritizing the private sector's engagement in this transition, we can establish the framework for long-term sustainable growth. Through the AfCFTA, we're working to create an environment that amplifies these contributions, where businesses can thrive, expand, create jobs, while safeguarding our environmental heritage. We have established the world's largest free trade area, which leverages on a market of $3.4 trillion US combined GDP as well as a population of 1.4 billion people. It is therefore critical that we accelerate the transition to net zero emissions, not only to confront the climate change crisis, but also as a pathway to significant economic growth. Achieving net zero means drastically reducing greenhouse emissions and balancing any remaining emissions with equivalent offsets. In this regard, studies indicate that bold climate action has the potential to yield at least $26 trillion in economic benefits globally by the year 2030. And Africa stands to benefit from this potential. We have seen across the continent examples of collaboration with the private sector and governments to identify projects that are bankable and invest in these projects. In Kenya, we have seen injection of investment in wind power projects, such as the Lake Turkana wind power project. In Morocco, in Southern Africa, in South Africa, in Namibia, and other parts of the continent, we have seen collaboration with the private sector. We therefore encourage the private sector to take drastic, bold actions that are designed to reduce carbon emissions, that are designed to ensure that we accelerate the transition that all of us want to see. The private sector holds significant potential in financing green innovation by supporting small medium enterprises that are engaged in sustainable businesses. For our part, the AfCFTA, we have done what we can to establish the appropriate regulatory environment for green transition to take place at an accelerated pace. We have a protocol on investment, and the protocol on investment emphasizes on sustainable investment, green industrial development, job creation, and green technology. We therefore invite the private sector to partner with us in the identification of these investment opportunities that not only will yield returns on the margins of investment, but also will ensure that we contribute to a green industrialization and green intra-Africa trade. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you, and thank you for those bold words, and what is in fact one of the boldest statements I've heard here at COP, which is what we need. You mentioned around the AfCFTA's mission is fostering resilience against climate shocks, making sure that the African countries are able to deal with the impacts that we know are coming, that have already come, but we know are going to get worse and more frequent. It'd be really good to understand some specific examples where the AfCFTA is prioritizing support to the very most climate vulnerable countries in Africa. What does that work look like? What are the priority sectors you've identified, and what difference are you already seeing that make?
Well, thank you very much again, Dominic, for the opportunity. Well, the first thing we've had to do is, as I said, to identify the specific sectors where we think we can make the most immediate impact and the fastest impact. In the area of agriculture, for example, we have identified countries on the continent that we are working with to develop green agricultural technology. Many countries, particularly in Southern Africa, confronted droughts. The droughts push out smallholder farmers, push them further into poverty. Yeah. They see their crops being devastated and destroyed by flooding. And so we have to think innovatively about the technology that we deploy in the agriculture sector to enable farmers to be more resilient and to benefit from the AfCFTA. In the area of in the industrial sector, manufacturing, here we see once again very unique opportunities. The continent of Africa is well endowed with platinum, well endowed with lithium, and other minerals that are critical as vehicles are being in the auto manufacturing sector. The transition that the global auto sector wants, and correctly wants to see, from combustion engines to electric-powered vehicles is something that we strongly support. Not only from the need for climate change resilience, but also for job creation and for industrial development and value addition of those minerals. Yesterday, you would have heard the Minister of Zambia announce that Zambia and the DRC are creating the world's largest special economic zone, a green special economic zone, for the production of batteries for electric vehicles. This is something that we strongly support with UNECA, Afreximbank, and we of course invite investors to look into these kinds of opportunities that not only support green industrial development in Africa, but also enable the continent of Africa to be more resilient in the challenge that we face with climate change. So we face since 2020, since the AfCFTA has been established, we have been facing a twin challenge. That twin challenge is establishing a domestic market in the AfCFTA, reducing intra-Africa barriers, but at the same time, we face this climate change crisis, which has manifested itself, as I said in my statement, in various ways. In droughts, in instability, in terrorism acts, particularly in the Sahel, where we see droughts leading to community instability. So this is a very, very serious challenge that we are facing, but we believe that through the Nairobi Declaration, the appropriate policy framework has been established. And actually, it's the first time that we see Africa speaking with one voice on this issue. And so we are most grateful to the government of Kenya for taking the lead in establishing a dialogue amongst the heads of states of the African continent, which will ensure that we have a shared action plan for how we tackle this challenge.
It's interesting. You mentioned the Minister of Zambia announcing the special economic zone between Zambia and the DRC. I mean, the climate issues are transboundary. We have water issues. I know in northern Namibia, the border is often defined with Angola by the river, but the river isn't there half the time now. And when it comes back, it's in a different place. We see, as you touched upon, drought. Several countries in Africa are suffering extreme drought. In the Horn, the drought has been going on for many years now and driving conflict, driving poverty. They're at the forefront of the impact of the damage that the climate is bringing to Africa. But you rightly said as well, it's bringing huge opportunity to rethink what the future looks like and how we get people into those jobs and bring prosperity. And so in that respect, what role, beyond the special economic zones, for example, in Zambia and DRC, can the private sector play in those transboundary issues of movement of people, movement of water, movement of goods? Because under the AfCFTA, that's what you're making possible. How does the private sector get behind you further to make sure that that is addressing the needs of which the communities need, but most importantly, the impact that climate is, the detrimental impact that climate is having on those communities?
Yes. Well, what I would wish to emphasize on this point is investment. The continent of Africa received only 0.6% of close to $435 billion of private sector climate change financing. And that, of course, is a very, very small amount. There are huge opportunities in solar. There are huge opportunities in wind. There are huge opportunities in hydro and other forms of renewable energy production that we see. And so we should not rely only on the development finance institutions and the commitments that they can mobilize. We should also leverage on the private sector to ensure that we see greater flows of investment into these job-producing sectors. Climate resilient sectors that at the same time drive industrialization and intra-Africa trade. So when you mention the cross-border and the trans-border initiatives that have to be taken from the point of view of the AfCFTA, the rules now enable this cross-border and movement of whether it is environmental goods or environmental services, that these environmental goods or services indeed can transit through borders at reduced tariffs. So there's an added advantage that we bring to investors, and that is that the continent, the market is no longer fragmented. It is a single market now. So to the extent that you are able to invest in a sector such as the auto sector, or indeed, as you mentioned, in solar or wind generation, the advantage is there of a market of 1.4 billion people to transit goods across borders in a manner that is far more simplified and harmonized today as opposed to, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago.
So I want to come back to the funding and the resources, but I want to pick up further on the point you just made. And for those that are not familiar with the environment before the AfCFTA was founded, before the incredible work that you've done since 2020, can you give us an example of what it was like? You know, why these opportunities weren't there? So the climate impact has brought the opportunities, but most importantly, the AfCFTA is enabling those opportunities to happen. Could you, for those that are not familiar with how things were on the ground before the Secretariat was formed, what did things look like? What were those barriers?
Well, there were a range of barriers. First, there were tariff barriers. In other words, taxes, and the highest taxes that we see amongst African countries on agricultural products before the AfCFTA, up to 60% duty on products, agricultural products that were traded. We had very, very deep market fragmentation, which we are still overcoming. It's not going to happen overnight. Africa's 55 countries were separated in terms of individual markets, making it extremely difficult for smallholder farmers, for small medium enterprises to trade across borders because of these very, very high tariffs. There were also beyond the border challenges, beyond the border measures, which made it very, very difficult. 55 countries having different standards, having different rules for trade, which meant that if you were a trader, you were really constrained to a regional or a national market. Otherwise, you have to comply with the rules of trade for a multiplicity of countries.
Chaos.
And then, of course, the issue of the challenge of reaching market and scaling. Because of smallness of individual economies in Africa, if you want to grow your business, you have to scale to a regional or continental level. Now, if you are confronted with all of these beyond the border measures, high duties, it's extremely difficult to trade in that environment. And so what we have done through the AfCFTA is to create a single market. Of course, it's evolving. It is not going to all be there overnight. It will take time. But the rules certainly have been developed to ensure that we have a single market for goods, for services, so that the agricultural sector benefits. For example, as we speak today, Uganda is exporting milk to Algeria. Before the AfCFTA, they would have to export this milk through rules, European rules, or WTO rules, but the rules were not continental rules. So there are specific examples of how these rules, individual countries have deployed them to see the benefits of the beginnings of a single market.
Well, I can say from my personal experience, I first invested in Kenya in around 2015. Our main target market was the US, under AGOA, but we had ambitions to sell domestically as well as into the East African region. It wasn't possible until the AfCFTA was established in 2020. Imagine you've got a factory making 15 million pairs of boxer shorts a month in Africa, in Kenya, and you couldn't sell one pair of boxer shorts to Uganda, to Rwanda, and to the regional markets. So a big business making sizable investments not being able to sell domestically in 2015. I can only shudder at the thought of how it was for cross-border traders, farmers, agriculture. But now, because of the work that AfCFTA has done, we don't just have the market of America, we have the most important market of the future, Africa. And it's interesting your comments about the investment piece coming in. I mean, I noticed recently an IMF report stated that of all funds, a lot of people talk about IMF in Africa and how much IMF is doing in Africa. But I may be mistaken here, but I understand all funds the IMF has deployed since its inception, only 2% has gone to Africa.
Yes, that's the point I was making. Not only development finance institution funding for climate finance resilience is negligible in respect of the African continent, but also private sector funding.
Yeah.
So certainly there's more that can be done.
Correct.
To mobilize private sector and development finance funding. We have established for our part with Afreximbank the AfCFTA Adjustment Fund.
Yes.
Special purpose vehicle that will be identifying investment opportunities in green industrial sectors.
Yeah.
So I mentioned, for example, manufacturing. I mentioned the auto sector.
Yes.
Green agricultural technology development. We have raised $1 billion.
Wow.
We will mobilize more. Of course, $1 billion is not a lot, but we will mobilize more, and we will target the private sector. We will target private equity firms. We will target large corporations that have an appetite to invest in Africa's industrial development. And of course, we will target development finance institutions so that that funding can be deployed towards green industrial development and green intra-Africa trade. We are at the very beginning, but I believe that we've got to start somewhere.
Indeed.
And so we will invite from early next year, we will embark on road shows to invite the private sector across the world to invest in Africa's green industrialization so that more of this funding, the $430 billion, a significant amount of it can come to the African continent.
Well, I mean, it's essential, and it's essential that businesses not only understand the economic opportunities, but they have increasingly more, and the demands must stay there to make a positive impact on planet and people. So I know from a recent World Bank report, it was saying that AfCFTA is going to bring, or is already started to bring, almost 30 million people out of poverty. I mean, businesses need to be committed to that. But most importantly, Africa is needing to add value to its rich minerals and resources, which the world needs to transition to net zero. So in the short term, we have these incredible results that you're driving. But what do you feel is the way for the long-term sustainability to, one, make sure those 30 million people that are coming out of poverty are continuing to prosper and progress in their economic life cycles, but also make sure that the value is created in Africa. It's no longer soil shipped to somewhere else in the world for Africa to then have to buy batteries back which contain its raw materials. You've often inspired me about those supply chains and the value addition. So it's the AfCFTA is not only just bringing 30 million people out of extreme poverty, it's going to drive hundreds of millions of people into prosperity of the new agendas of which the world is setting itself, must set itself. They can't change without Africa. We cannot get to net zero without Africa. So how do we make sure they come in a long and sustainable manner?
The path to net zero is a challenging path, but also has opportunities. Let me repeat the point I made earlier, and that is that when we set out to implement the AfCFTA, it was in the context of an unprecedented number of crises across the African continent that were caused by climate change. Sahel, at that time, Mozambique was experiencing floods. Recently, we see the drought in Zambia. That is a massive challenge, but it's also an opportunity.
Correct.
In the sense that you mentioned of accelerating green industrial development. The critical mineral strategy of the African Union, that strategy is absolutely indispensable. Where we identify specific minerals that are key to increased growth, economic growth in the world, but also not only in the world, but on the African continent, we therefore must accelerate the effort for value addition in Africa of those minerals, whether it is lithium batteries or copper or platinum. These critical minerals that power global industrial development and global growth must be processed, and the value addition must happen on the African continent. We have begun to see examples of this, nowhere near, of course, the scale where it should be, but we do see examples of how the processing, value addition of these critical minerals in Africa can address not only the climate change question and challenge, but also can make a contribution to global reduction to net zero, and at the same time make a contribution to continued and sustained global industrial development. So the critical minerals of the African continent are absolutely essential to resilience against climate change, industrial development that continues, and of course are absolutely critical to Africa's own sustainability imperatives. And so it is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And what we would like to see out of this gathering, which is what we said last year in Dubai, is that these commitments for financing, for climate change, we must see the commitments being lived up to. We must see the financial commitments having tangible impact in value addition, for example, in investing in hydro, in wind, in solar. We have over 60%, the African continent has over 60% potential for producing solar, but we produce only 1%. So that deficit, on the face of it, is a deficit, but it's an opportunity to scale in the production of solar through investment. So I emphasize the point that it's an unprecedented challenge, but it's also an unprecedented opportunity that can service green industrial development and green intra-Africa trade.
So on these industries, and you make the clear point that it's going to happen in Africa. There's no, you're not mixing your words. It's very clear. It's going to happen in Africa. It has to happen. It must. And I think the world needs to start, those that don't accept that need to start accepting it. But to deliver it, what is your vision and strategy? And I know the AfCFTA has done a lot of work on this, but I'd love to hear it from you personally, around developing those green skills so that we can make sure the young men and women of Africa have the skills for the wind turbines, for the solar energy, to service the electric vehicles that are going to be produced in Africa. I mean, when I built my businesses in Africa, there were some skills which we had challenges to find domestically. But when we brought people in from outside the continent, we told them, your job is to be out of a job. Your bonus and success is rated on making sure you're out of a job. You've got to get out. You're not here to run businesses in Africa. You're here to help Africa run businesses for Africa and go. So we do the skills gap and the capacity is a long-term challenge, but is an opportunity that you've already started the path of. I mean, it would be really good to hear about that, particularly for the young men and women of Africa which have started those journeys under visions such as yours. What that looks like, what you see that journey being for making sure those green jobs and skills are developed in Africa.
Well, we play a catalyst role in the sense of encouraging, whether it's our development finance institutions on the continent, or indeed whether it is the private sector. We play a catalyst role in encouraging them to do more, to train young Africans for the preparedness and readiness to contribute to net zero production on the continent. So, for example, we have in Kenya, there is the largest green data processing center in Naivasha.
Yes.
And that data processing center, first of its kind, that is green, generates jobs for young people. In Cote d'Ivoire is building the largest, not Cote d'Ivoire, Cabo Verde. Cabo Verde is building the largest technology park. And over 60%, the government estimates over 60% of people who work there will be young people who will require skills to adapt to a green digital economy. So green digital industrialization is beginning to emerge as an important sector of drawing young people into the labor force. When we talk about the transition to electric vehicles, that too has opportunities, particularly for the auto industry, opportunities to draw in millions and millions of young people into the supply chain, the green supply chain of the new auto sector supply chain line, actually, which is beginning to emerge and focusing on the green industrial sector in the autos. So we play a catalyst role of encouraging the private sector and development finance institutions to ensure that whatever jobs are created, that first they are jobs that are skills-based, that attract young people, that enable young people to have sustainability in their careers. The private sector, as you correctly mentioned, plays a very important role in this regard, and I'm happy to hear that you yourself, as a leading entrepreneur, have recognized this point. The issue of transfer of skills, transferring skills in the shortest amount of time, we've discussed it in the past. Create jobs by getting out of a job is absolutely essential to how, as we confront this climate change crisis, we at the same time can create jobs for young people.
It's incredible to hear, and I think 25% of the world's population will be in Africa by 2050, and an even larger proportion of the world's young will be on the continent. So the opportunities are incredible for them. I wanted to ask, just reflecting on this COP, do you feel that the penny has dropped? Are people starting to realise that the challenges, say, for example, in the Horn of Africa? I've spent time there. It's a very windy place. It's a very hot and dry place. Yet most people have diesel generators at home, which are causing pollution, but also costing huge amounts of money to run. Maybe 50, 60, 70 US cent a kilowatt hour. I mean, crazy prices. So, for local manufacturers in the Horn, even local traders, just trying to keep the lights on or your machinery going, it's prohibitive. Are you seeing that the private sector and governments are realising, actually, we do need to get the grids built, it will create jobs. We do need to connect it to the natural resources that these countries have, solar or wind or whatever it might be. And we do recognise and understand it will take people out of poverty, it will take people away from famine, and it will take people away from conflict. I mean, for me, it's quite a simple message, and you say it far better than I do. But are you sensing from the various COPs you've been to that evolution of knowledge of get people into jobs, get people trading, get the resources to the people in the communities where they exist, will bring prosperity, reduce conflict, and reduce climate impact? Are you seeing that message is starting to ring home more and more?
I think the message is, to use your phrase, the penny has dropped. But where the penny continues not to drop is in respect of financing.
Yeah.
The financing gap remains quite significant. In fact, it's ever widening.
Yeah.
And so whilst there is a recognition that all of us are confronting a common challenge, but the financing solution is deployed unevenly. I mentioned the figures of the negligible amounts of climate change financing that the continent of Africa receives vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And so I think whilst we do need to continue from a policy position to speak with one voice as the world, to confront the challenge with one voice as the world, but there is an unevenness in the financing, and that financing gap, I'm not encouraged, even here, I'm not encouraged that we've seen significant amounts of commitments that actually have been lived up to.
Indeed.
And have been put on the table. So this is something that it concerns me. I think that, and here I can speak only for the continent of Africa, through the Nairobi Declaration, the leadership of the African continent and the leadership of Kenya in putting and proposing Africa Green Industrialization Initiative in Dubai last December is an example of the seriousness with which we view this challenge and also the solutions that we are putting forward to the world.
Indeed.
We have overcome, and this is where the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative is absolutely key. We have overcome the debate, the binary debate of industrial development vis-a-vis climate change. Can you industrialize, with a low carbon emissions context? That debate is now behind us.
Yeah.
The Africa Green Industrialization Initiative makes it very, very clear that you can develop, but doing so with a very strong commitment to environmental concerns and imperatives. The next step now is for us to accelerate the mobilization of investment so that we can see the projects after the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative being appropriately financed over a sustained period of time. So on the one hand, I think there's reason to be encouraged.
Yes.
Encouraged in the sense of the progress that has been made from a policy perspective, but we have to do more.
Indeed.
From a financing gap point of view.
So, in essence, the penny has dropped, but now we need the billions to drop.
That's right. The billions must drop on the table.
Exactly.
That's where the gap is now.
I'm very impressed by the Nairobi Declaration, and I think a year on, it's not just being talked about. There is more action happening. There's more work being done in that. And I'm conscious you have to get on to many more meetings today. It is always a pleasure and quite honestly inspiring to sit and speak with you, Your Excellency. I went to Africa because it excited me so much, and it excites me today more than ever. I was fortunate enough for Africa to welcome me and work with me to build jobs and help communities prosper. But I did that before the AfCFTA, so the opportunities now are even greater to help those communities work, help those communities prosper. And it's a real pleasure to be able to hear a year on where things have moved to, where they're going. And as soon as I'm out of Azerbaijan, it's a beautiful place here, very happy to be here. I'm getting on a plane to Rwanda. You know, that's what I'm excited about beyond these conversations today. Would you like to make any closing remarks? Do you have time for a couple of closing remarks?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dominic. I would reiterate that we are facing an unprecedented crisis in Africa as a result of climate change. We've mentioned repeatedly the situation in Zambia, the floods that took place in Mozambique, the drought in the Sahel, causing instability and insecurity and a rise in terrorism. All of these are challenges, but I believe very strongly that through the Nairobi Declaration, we have turned the chapter.
Yeah.
We have turned the page, rather. We have an opportunity to accelerate mobilization of investment. We now know our priority sectors. We know it is solar, it is wind, hydrogen. We know where the sectors of greatest contribution to fight climate change are. What is required is the financing. And that's where I believe more work has to be done, not only by us as Africans, but the international community and the international private sector as a whole.
Well, Your Excellency, rest assured at this forum, we will be taking that message forwards with our audiences online. I know we have many viewing currently from the feeds. I know they will also be taking that message forwards, but we will do all we can to support. And I think what I would say to those investors in the world, whether it's the banks, the private sector, that your developed markets are saturated. You can't just keep buying your competition because you're not getting more market growth. You might get more market share. One day that's gone. Africa, on all elements for business for me, is the future. And those investments must come because I think people will be very foolish not to. It's very compelling and more importantly, the continent is the most wonderful place to be. So, Your Excellency, thank you so much. Thank you for inspiring us and thank you for continuing to drive that message of prosperity and growth on the continent.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you, Dominic.